Welcome back to another TSQL series. In today's video, we are going to be going over a popular topic. I would say when it comes to learning about basic SQL, this is obviously a topic that I would say is not covered very heavily, but once you kind of get familiar with SQL, it's a very nice tool to have at your disposal because it makes certain data transformation processes very easy. So what we're going to be talking about today is pivoting and unpivoting. But in this particular portion, we're going to focus just on the pivot. So the second video, well, it might be a 3-video series. I'm just debating how long it's going to be. But for this particular one, we're going to just focus on pivot. So what is the idea of pivoting data? Well, lucky for us, I have some data that's in a table already. And so I have in my Sigma coding database, I have a table called sales data. And let's say I want to query this data, right? So you can see right here that we have a few columns of information. So one is the year, the next one is the month, and the next one is the number of items sold during that month, the price, and then the revenue, and then the cost. So just a very basic table with some information here. But right now, it's not in the format that I would like. So for example, this wonderful year column right here, I would really like these values in this year column to be my column headers. So for example, I would have 2008 revenue, 2009 revenue, 2010 revenue, and then maybe we'll see down the road, we can actually do multiple aggregations. So in essence, to give you an idea of what it should look like at the end, I'll show you what our end goal is for at least a simple example. So at least a relatively simple one. So we want something like this. So if I say, hey, give me the revenue or the average or something like that for a particular column, it will return that value back to us. So that's the idea with pivoting is we're going to take some row values in a particular column and have them now serve as column headers. So with that being said, how do we do it? Well, whenever we tackle a pivot column, it's usually made up of different components. One of the components is what we call the source query. So you can think of your source query as the data that you're going to be transforming, right? So this is the original data in its raw format like we're seeing right now. So for example, I would consider this my raw query if these were all the values that I was going to try to pivot. Now in our particular example, we're going to keep it simple at this point, and we're just going to pivot year and then revenue. So that's all we're going to do in our simple example. So what we would want is we would rewrite our select statement to say, okay, give me the year, and then if you could also give me revenue. And what I also want to make sure I do is I specify the table it's coming from, and that's pretty straightforward. It's just coming from the Sigma coding database, this particular schema, and then this particular table. So very simple at this point. Oh, I shouldn't have executed it just like that. But we now just have 2 columns. We no longer have all of the columns that we had up above. We just have consolidated it to the columns that we're planning to transform. Now, obviously, depending on the type of query that you're doing, this could definitely be more complex than this, but let's start with a simple example and go from there. So what we're going to do is I'm going to write another select statement that is above this one. So I'm going to do select. And for right now, I'll just do star and then from. And then what we're going to do is we're going to store this source query and we're going to treat it like a table, right? So we're going to treat it like a table. And really kind of what we could say here potentially is this is our source query. And right now we're going to select all the columns from that source query. We haven't done any transformation. We've simply have just wrote our source query in such a way that it's kind of this now inner query. And whenever we do something like that, we need to give our source query an alias name. So this is a name that we can then refer to it in other queries that are outside our particular source query. So in this case, I'll give it something very basic. I'll just say it's the sales underscore data. And if you see, if I run everything just like I did right here, you'll notice we get the same exact result. So again, nothing fancy at this point. All we've done is we've defined our source query. And so again, this is the data that we're planning to transform. We gave that source data query an alias name, so that way we can easily refer to it anywhere else in another query. And now that we've done that, we can now move on to the fun part, which is the pivoting part. We have our source data. We can now pivot our source data. And so when we use the pivot function, we have to specify which values will become the column headers and the aggregation we want to perform. It's very important that you understand you have to provide an aggregation for the pivot function. If you do not provide an aggregation, unfortunately, it will not run for you. So to pivot our data, it's very simple. We're just going to do our little brackets again, and then anything we write inside these two little brackets will be part of our pivot query, if you want to think about it. Now, we also do need to give this particular little query its own alias name, and so we'll call this sales pivot by year. You want to try to give it something intuitive, so that way if you're looking back at this, you're not going, what is going on? Because I've done that before, and it's not fun trying to understand how you were thinking 3 months ago. Okay, so now that we've done that, we've defined our pivot function, but we haven't defined our aggregation. So our aggregation at this point is going to be very simple. We're just going to take an average of that revenue column, okay? So we're going to take an average of that revenue column. And here comes the fun part. So now we have to specify the years that we want to serve as our column headers. So the way we write this is the syntax is for specify the column that contains the values that you want to serve as the column headers. We then do in, and then we specify the values inside that column that we want to serve as the column headers. So hopefully that's very simple to understand at this point, but at this point, we've defined our aggregation. We define the column that we want to look for the values that we want to serve as our column headers, and then we specified the values that we want to be our column headers. So let's see what we get when we run it now. Okay, so pretty basic at this point. We now have our values. They are in the correct, hold on, I'm going to bring this down just a tiny bit. And so they're now in the correct values. So we now have 2008, we now have 2009, we now have 2010. Unfortunately, these are not very meaningful column names because I can't really tell all that is basically part of this. So I really should rename my particular column names. And I should also make sure they're the proper data type. I don't like that this one has all these like little trailing decimals and everything like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the cast function. So we'll use cast. And for the cast function, we have to specify the column that we want to basically cast the data type for. And we have to specify the data type we want it to be. So in this case, I'm going to want it to be a decimal. And then if you actually, well, I don't know if it's going to do it for me. You can see decimal is a data type inside of TSQL. And so 18 is going to basically be the number of, I can't remember the exact word. I think it's precision. Maybe 2 is precision. So this second one is precision. This one's basically defining the maximum number of numeric values that it can be. So basically the maximum numbers that it can be. So we're saying it can be 18 numbers long, but we're going to only show it to 2 decimal places. I can never remember decimal if my life depended on me. Okay, so now that we've done that, we've now cast that as a decimal, and then we can give it a new column name. And so we can say 2008 average revenue. And what I'll do is I'll lowercase that. And if we do that now, hopefully we see something a little bit more meaningful. Now I'm going to repeat this process a couple times just so that way we do it for each column, because right now it's only selecting that one. And what we'll do after this is we'll do 2009, we'll do 2010, and then we'll do execute. Oh, I forgot my comma. Do Control A, and then was it function? No, F5. Oh, I can't really do that because I have one up above. If you select it all, we'll run each one, and then it puts it in its own query window. But now at this point, we have something that's a little bit more meaningful. We have the correct data types, and we also made sure our column headers have the right name. Now, technically, you could even modify this maybe a little bit more. Maybe you would want to just add an extra column that says, I don't know, value or category, and then you could have just it be revenue or something. Like, I know some people, they try to do financial modeling with SQL, so in that case it might make a little bit more sense. Okay, so that's a very simple example of pivoting inside of SQL. So again, we have our source query that contains the data we want to transform. We have our pivot function, which defines the aggregation that we want to perform. And then we also have that second statement, which defines the column that contains the values we want to have serve as our column headers, and then the values in that column that we want to be the column headers. And then from here, it's just selecting those particular column headers from our pivot statement. So that's all it is for a pivot. Now, if you want, you can actually do multiple aggregations at once. So sometimes you might want to do average revenue, and then maybe this one you might want to do, I don't know, like a count, for example, right? You might want to do a count. Well, with that particular example, it's a little bit more complicated, but the idea is relatively the same. So what we're going to do next is I'm going to make sure I move my notes so that way I have it. And I'm going to show you some tricks that will allow us to do multiple aggregations at once. So let's keep it simple still. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to open up just a new window so that way it's a lot easier to see. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to define our source query, right? So we're familiar with this. So we're going to say select from, and then if I do a Sigma coding database, and then I do DBO, and then if I do my sales data, I should be good. And with this one, it's going to be a little bit tricky. It's not necessarily intuitive right away, but we're going to select our year column. And then here comes the fun part. Yeah, and then technically we don't need, we'll just keep it for right now. We're going to basically select our year column again, but we're going to do something special with it. We're going to first cast our year column as nvarchar. And then in this case, it's just going to be 5 characters long. So it's just a numeric character string. And with this one, what we're going to do is we're going to concatenate onto that string at the end of it, _1. And we're going to rename this column year 1. Okay? This is basically a copy of this column, but we just modified it a little bit. And I'll explain in a little bit why we got to do that. And then we're going to do the same thing again, but for this one, we're going to change it to 2. And then from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select revenue. And then I'm going to select items _ sold. Okay. So let's see what we get with our source query. So we have our year column, our year 1, our year 2, revenue, and items sold. You might be asking, why do I have to do this multiple times? For the pivot function, we cannot use the same column twice in 2 different pivot functions. Because we're going to be doing multiple aggregations, we're going to be basically copying this step twice in the same query. If we do that, we cannot use the same column in this particular query. It will give you an error. So the workaround is you basically take the column that you want to what you want to pivot, and you make a copy of it. And you do it as many times for as many aggregations as you're planning to do on the different particular columns in your query. So what we'll do from here is we'll now write our outer query, and we'll say select star from, and then we'll make sure to put it in our bracket, and then we'll give this an alias name. We'll just call it source data, something simple. And then usually if it's an inner query, I like to kind of indent it so it's a little bit more intuitive, and then add a comment. So I didn't do this on the last one, but here I will. So we'll just call this source query raw data. Just something where if you're looking back, you're not completely lost as to what was going on. So what we've done from there is okay so far, but we're going to have to do another step, and we're going to have to basically take this one right here, and we're going to modify it a little bit more. So we're going to use this next one to actually do another step in the process, which we're going to define as grouping it. Because if you see right now, we've got an issue, which is I've got too many in the sense of if I only want to do certain columns, I've got to group it first. And then what we're going to do is we're going to kind of do a little trick, so that way we don't have to do the specific aggregation in the pivot. So this sometimes is necessary. It just makes the process easier where you do the aggregation before you pivot, and all you would do with pivot is you just sum it, because summing's just going to literally give you the same value back if you wrote your query in a very particular way. So sometimes, not always, it makes sense to do the aggregation before you pivot. So we have our source data. So we have our source data right here. What we're going to do next is our aggregation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say select. We're going to select that year. And then we're going to select year _1. And then we're going to do select year _2. And then we're going to do an average. So we're going to do an average of revenue. And again, we'll just give this the same exact name at this point. We'll just call it revenue, just for simplicity's sakes. And then from here, we're going to take the average of items sold. And again, we'll just give it the same exact name as it had before. This is just for simplicity's sake. You don't technically have to do that, but sometimes it makes a little bit more sense to do that. Okay, so now that we've done that, because we've done an aggregation, we have to do a group by clause. But before we can do our group by clause, we have to filter our particular data set. And so we use the where statement to basically say, what values do we want to actually return back? So what rows do we want to return back? Well, what we're going to say is where the year column contains the value 2008, 2009, 2010. Now, some people will say where year equals 2008, or year equals 2009, or year equals 2010. Personally, I think this is just easier, so I use the in keyword, and then you can specify all the values that you want to return back, or basically all the values in that particular column that if they match, you want to return those rows back. So if you run this, I'll show you what it does before. Well, we can't technically because we have the aggregation. And then, again, because we have the aggregation, we're going to say group by year. And then we're going to say group by year 1. And then group by year 2. Okay? So these are the ones that are going to stay the same. These are the ones we're aggregating. Anything that stays the same, you put in the group by clause. If you're going to aggregate it, you don't put it in the group by clause. So let's see what we get with this one. There we go. So definitely our data set has been consolidated pretty dramatically compared to what it was before. We now only have 3 rows, one for 2008, 9, and 10. And then we also have the aggregation that was performed. You can also tell that some of this is not clean yet, but when we get there, we'll take care of it. So at this point, we've now done the second outer query. So again, just to make things more complicated, I'm going to do another select statement. We'll keep it simple. We'll just select all the columns, and then we'll define the table in essence that we're querying from. And then again, it does have to have a alias name. I think at this point, it makes sense to maybe call it something different than source data. So we'll call it source data group. I'll indent it for some readability purposes. And then I'll add my comments and I'll say group the raw data by year and perform aggregation. That's all we're doing. And so all we did, source data, aggregation, and then we just gave everything an alias. The way I like to think about it is this returns a table, this returns a table. That's why you see these brackets that kind of surround that query, because if you consider it, just say, for example, this was a table, what you're really saying is select all the columns from the table that we have at this point in time. It just is that that table is changing a little bit as you go deeper in. So this is the original one. This is the next level out. So that's after it's been modified. And here we're just selecting those modified columns. So with that, we can now move on to the next part, which is pivoting. So with pivoting in this example, we're going to change it up a little bit. So we're going to keep that first one the same, and we're going to do pivot. And we're going to do what we always do because it's a pivot. What do? We do our aggregation first. So we're in this example, because we've already done that aggregation, we're just going to keep it the same, and we're going to do revenue. So we're just going to do sum. So if we sum it, it's just going to return that value for that particular row. So in that case, it's just going to return the value that's already there. So very simple. In some cases, that makes more sense. In other cases, you might not approach it like that. It really kind of just depends how your data is and what's going on with it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, we want to do that. So right now, what we want is each value in our year one column to basically serve as a column header. So in this case, it's going to be 2008_1, and then 2008_2, and then 2008_, I don't know why I did 2008 again. Oh, lordy, lordy, lord. It's been one of those days. Okay, perfect. And then we'll give this one as sales_pivot by year. And that's really our first one. So if we run this right now, we get something like that. So how you can think about it is these would be our revenue columns. And then the second one that we're going to pivot is our item. So we'd have revenue column 1, item column 1, revenue column 2, item column 2, and so on. So you basically are defining a column for each value. Now, you can see here that I am keeping those, I'm basically using that copied column I made here. I could have used the original year one, but in my particular example, for some readability purposes, I'm actually going to keep this column here. But you don't technically have to do that. So say you wanted to remove this one, that's fine. You could actually use this one and you wouldn't have to do this twice. But in my example, because I'm kind of more focusing on the output, I wanted to copy it twice. Okay, so that's the first pivot. What we're going to do next is the second pivot. Now, in the second pivot, we're not doing the revenue column anymore. We're going to be doing items sold. Now, you can already see right here, IntelliSense is letting you know you're committing a big problem or a big mistake. You're using the same column in another pivot function. So you can't do that. You have to make sure you use a separate one each time. So you have to use a separate column for each individual aggregation. Now, I do want to make sure I give it a different alias name just for, again, readability purposes. So you can see now we should have a column that for each one. Okay, so that's looking a little bit better. What I'm going to do next is, just for time constraints, I'm going to actually take one of my particular ones. Pivot, there it is. because this one I have to do it so many times, it's just not worth it. All I do is I kind of do what I did before, which was I rename the columns, but I also use what we call the coalesce function. And so basically the coalesce function will replace null values with whatever value you specify. So the way you would read this is you say, okay, for the coalesce function for column 2008_1, if you find a null value, replace that null value with a 0. And then you would repeat that logic each time. Now, this is kind of the issue that you're kind of hopefully starting to see with pivot, which is depending on the number of columns that you're doing, you could have a very, very complex query. We'll talk about how we can help mitigate that problem by using dynamic pivot queries, but hopefully you're starting to realize that, oh, this can get a little bit complicated if we're not careful. And oh, let me do the year one too. I forgot about that one. I guess for whatever reason I deleted it from the other one, but you can hopefully see. So you can see average revenue, average item. I guess if you wanted to make a little bit more, you could have items come right behind this, but that's just, reorganizing the columns, nothing crazy. But yeah, so this is how you would do multiple aggregations at the same time. It does come out a little bit weird sometimes because obviously in this example, you have these 0 values, but in some cases you might want it like that. And if that's the case, then this query would work for you. If you didn't want those zeros, then you might actually have an issue and you probably wouldn't be able to do it like this. The nice thing about SQL is there's a lot of different ways to do the same thing. So let me check the time. Yeah, I'll cut it off. Okay, so I'll cut the video at this point. So just to recap a little bit, in this portion, we have focused entirely on pivot. So we started out with a simple pivot example. So we just took a single column in a table and we pivoted it, and then we did an aggregation on the other column. So we did year and revenue, and then we went to a little bit more of a complex pivot example where we wanted to aggregate multiple columns from the same table, and we saw that we have to do 2 separate pivot function queries in essence. And we also had to copy the column that we're planning to pivot multiple times for each pivot function that we were planning to build. Because with pivot functions, you cannot use the same column twice. You have to give it a different column each time. So you can basically copy an original column and do it that way. And then also, in some cases, not all cases, it makes sense to do the aggregation before you do the pivot. Because if you do the aggregation before, sometimes the query is a little bit easier. And when you do it in the pivot function, all you do is a sum aggregation, because it basically just returns the same value that was returned by the aggregation function. So that is what we covered so far. In our next portion of this series, we are going to talk about dynamic pivot queries. And so with those ones, we're going to see that we don't actually have to write it out all the time. And so we can actually write our queries in such a way that they will simply grab all the unique values in a particular column. And if that column was to add new values, then your pivot query would automatically incorporate those new values and have them serve as column headers. So really cool, really useful for some of you out there who might work with some time series data. So at this point, any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below and I will try to get back to you. Otherwise, we will see you in the next video.